I just love this environment. This is the Great American West. Hey, my name's Matt, and I'm back with more tips to help you enjoy the best of the West. I am at Arches National Park right now. Behind me are some formations called marching men. Looks like they're marching. I'm not sure if they're marching uphill or downhill, actually. Put it in the comments if you have an opinion on that. In this video, I'm going to give you tips for hiking in the desert. So my first tip is to have some shade. You need to have a hat to shade you from the sun. It is obviously hot in the desert, and it'll surprise you. I know it's not humid, but it can still get blazing hot out here in the desert. Having a little shade for your head and for your face is going to go a long ways. So in case you're not a big hiker, you haven't hiked around some of this desert country before, I just wanted to give you a couple of tips here real quick. First, you'll see these little piles of rocks here that you see here, and then you kind of see it out in the distance there, and they're stacked up on top of each other. These are actually created by the National Park Service to keep you on trail, so they're called rock cairns. Not Karens like I want to talk to the manager Karen. They are C-A-I-R-N-S, rock cairns. And so you really need to keep an eye out here at Arches for these rock cairns because they help keep you on the path. Out here in the desert, a lot of times you're walking across slick rock and there's really no marked path. So you have to follow those. The other thing is, if you look back here, you'll see a series of rocks here. So they've kind of created a little border there to kind of guide you. And then here's another important one, is that a lot of times the Park Service will grab some dead wood and they'll put it in front of an area that looks like it might be a trail. So they'll put it there as a border to keep you from going off on the wrong trail. But you have to kind of look at the wood there, because sometimes there's just a root from a tree that's going across the trail and you actually have to cross over it. So take a look at that root to see whether it's in the ground or whether it's just a dead piece of wood that the park has put there as an indication of where you need to go. Okay, my next tip for desert hiking is to know the weather before you go. This is so important in the desert, probably important anytime you go hiking, but especially in the desert because the weather can be so extreme. So first of all, it can get boiling hot, so you're going to have to be prepared with shade and water if it's going to be super hot. If there's rain in the forecast, though, you probably don't want to hike in a lot of cases, because you see this riverbed here. This is called the dry wash behind me. Sometimes these can turn into raging flash floods when it rains. Sometimes the ground just becomes so wet and muddy that you can't get around. So you really need to know the weather before you head out on the trail. Okay, my next tip is do not leave the trail. This applies to all hiking, of course, but in the desert, not only do you not leave the trail because you don't want to get lost, but also the soil is incredibly delicate. It doesn't look like much, but it's got kind of a crusty top to it. And that has taken thousands of years to develop, and it has something to do with protecting the bacteria and the life and stuff like that in the soil. But when you step on it and smash it, it ruins thousands of years of nature's work. So stay on the trail. Okay, my next tip is to bring water and snacks. So it's quite obvious that you're in the desert, you're in a very dry environment, it's very hot, and you have to take water. I mean, you absolutely must bring water. So we have a Camelback that my wife researched out, and she thought this was the best one. It's the Camelback Mule. We'll put a link in the description. But whatever you do, have plenty of water to get through your day, especially if you're not from the West. You can dry out pretty easily. I would also recommend bringing chapstick while you're at it and lotion, because again, if you're not from around the West, it's very arid and dry, and you could definitely dry out pretty easily if you're not used to it. Okay, now it's very common sense to bring a lot of water, obviously, and for many years, people were constantly urged by the Park Service to drink water, drink water. Well, there've actually been a rise in deaths and hospitalizations in the Grand Canyon because people are drinking too much water. So the issue there is that they're not eating enough salty snacks, so they're kind of diluting the salt in their body by drinking too much water, and so there's been kind of a increase of cases there. It's kind of become a little bit of an issue. So now when you go to the national parks, they'll almost always tell you to bring water and salty snacks. So I've got a Cliff Bar here. Whatever you like there, bring. But make sure it's both water and snacks while you're out in the desert. Okay, I have 2 more tips here. First thing is shoes. So we think that boots are generally overkill when you're hiking in the desert. We want to have shoes that are a little more lightweight to get around. Typically it's not muddy if you're avoiding hiking in the rain, of course. And so we just say tennis shoes for the most part. So my wife likes Adidas shoes, and she kind of swears by those. She loves them. They're flexible and all that. I often wore those as well, but recently I bought some Hoka shoes. What I like about those is that the sole is a little thicker, and so I don't quite feel all the little rocks and pebbles underneath my feet like I would with Adidas or some shoes like that. So whatever suits your fancy there. We'll put links in the description, of course, but we prefer shoes over boots. Now, the other tip that just kind of came to mind is if you're not from the West and you come out here, it's really high elevation and it's really dry. So for a lot of people, oxygen can be a bit of an issue. And I actually just thought about this, that you might want to pack a little container of oxygen so you can get a hit if you need it. This is something, as we've gotten older, we joke with our friends. We play softball in a softball league, and sometimes when you're sprinting around the bases, you get kind of out of oxygen, you get winded when you get older. And so we have a little can of oxygen at third base so we can get a little hit there if we get a triple or something like that. So I just thought about that. If you're not from the West, a little can of oxygen might do you some good. Okay, my next tip is to make sure you bring sunscreen. So that may sound obvious as well, but people forget, and certainly you'll burn out here in the desert if you don't bring sunscreen. The next thing is to make sure you understand that the desert environment is extreme, both on the hot and on the cold. So if you're doing some early morning hiking or evening hiking, which is highly recommended so you can avoid the heat of the day, consider bringing some layers. So I have this vest here, which has been really, really nice on this trip because it does get quite cold. So once the sun goes down, it can get very cold in the desert because in the United States, the desert is high elevation. I'm up over like 7,000 feet right now, I think, above sea level. So it's high, which means at night it gets very cold. My next tip is to do it. Go for a hike in the great American desert. It's so cool. You're going to feel like you're in a Western movie. It's really awesome. And my final tip is to watch our playlists. We have many playlists covering places in the West, Arches, Zion, Bryce, the Grand Canyon, awesome places in the West to visit and go for hikes in the desert.